This video traces jazz of the 1970s and 80s, moving from fusion to the new traditionalists. As reflected in the quote from Miles Davis, by the 1970s, there was widespread concern among jazz musicians that jazz might not have a future. Audiences, white and black, were increasingly absorbed with rock and pop. The experimental modal and free jazz of the 1960s had done little to build new audiences. Once again, Miles Davis will be at the forefront of a movement that came to be known as jazz rock fusion. Jazz rock fusion occurred as rock groups added more improvisation and a wide variety of instruments traditionally associated with jazz to their music. You might recognize bands such as those pictured on the screen, Chicago and Earth, Wind and Fire, to name just two of the many 1970s rock groups that explored jazz sounds. The target audiences for these groups was young and often African American. At the same time as this was happening in rock, jazz groups were employing more and more electronic instruments. Miles Davis's 1970 album, Bitches Brew, led the charge from the field of jazz. Performers include Miles Davis on trumpet, Wayne Shorter on soprano saxophone, Chick Corea and Joe Zawinul on keyboards, and John McLaughlin on electric guitar. You see Shorter, McLaughlin, and Corea on your screen. Make sure to study the short version of one of the most important tracks on the album in the listening guide on the course website. Its title is Miles Runs the Voodoo Down. Although the graphic isn't as clear as I'd like, you may be able to see in this diagram from a jazz textbook published by Prentice Hall called Discovered Jazz, the personnel list for Bitches Brew. It reads like a who's who of jazz musicians active since the 1970s. We'll look at a few of their subsequent fusion hits below. One of the most popular fusion groups of the 1970s was Weather Report. It consisted of Joe Zawinul on keyboards, Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Jaco Pastorius on bass, and Alex Cunha and Manola Badrina on percussion. The group's 1977 album, Heavy Weather, pulled in numerous awards, including a Grammy nomination for Pastorius for Best Jazz Solo and a nomination of the tune Birdland for Best Instrumental Composition. Birdland hit number 1 on the Billboard Jazz chart and number 30 on the Billboard Top 200 chart. Study Birdland with its listening guide on the course website. Herbie Hancock has been one of the most important jazz pianists since the 1970s. Another is Chick Corea, who unfortunately we won't have time to talk about. Although Hancock played throughout the 60s with no less a figure than Miles Davis, his career really took off with the release of the 1973 album entitled Headhunters. On it, Hancock merges jazz with electronica and what he described as more earthy and funky music. Watermelon Man, a tune that Hancock had first composed and recorded some 10 years earlier, appears on Headhunters in a setting that opens and closes with African-inspired beer bottle playing. Do study it on the listening guide on the course website. The most famous jazz musician today is probably Wynton Marsalis. Born in 1961 in New Orleans to a family active in the professional jazz world, he was sent to Juilliard to study trumpet. Much like Miles Davis before him, he was more inspired by the jazz scene than by the classical scene, and he auditioned to play with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. The story goes that upon discovering whose son the stellar young trumpeter was, Art Blakey hardly felt that he could accept him in his band, not wanting to derail Wynton's father's desires that his son finish his training at Juilliard. Gradually, however, Marsalis started fronting his own bands. This is after playing with Blakey, and he also started composing his own music. In 1987, he co-founded Jazz at Lincoln Center. As the artistic director for the prestigious institution, he has constantly worked to keep jazz fresh. Marsalis' music often harkens back to earlier days of jazz, from the blues and traditional jazz of New Orleans to swing sounds of big band arrangements. You can hear this in your listening guide in his Big Trouble and the Big Easy. This is part of a soundtrack that he wrote for the 1990 comedy Tune in Tomorrow, set in New Orleans. I should note that although Marsalis often plays music of a swing and bluesy style, he can play bebop with the best of them. Maria Schneider is another contemporary American big band leader whose jazz orchestra has received many awards. You can listen to her Hang Gliding on your YouTube playlist or at her website. Another example of the diverse directions that jazz has taken today is the music of Regina Carter. Carter, pictured on your screen, grew up in Detroit playing classical violin, but listening to the music of R&B and Motown. After studying at the New England Conservatory, she returned to Detroit and started playing jazz violin. Now, jazz violin may strike you as a novelty, but in actuality, string instruments such as the violin have been part of jazz since its beginnings. The fact that she won the prestigious MacArthur Genius Grant in 2006 speaks to her musical successes. Do listen to her Papa Was a Rolling Stone from her 1999 album Rhythms of the Heart. That should be on your course listening guide. This tune, of course, was made famous by the Motown group The Temptations in 1972. Carter's jazzier version, which also features the fine jazz vocalist Cassandra Wilson, infuses the tune with funk and reggae influences. A final example of jazz from the last 50 years is the music of Michael Brecker. Brecker was a phenomenal saxophonist who died way too young. His playing was fast and accurate, and he brought that to bear on his experiments with the EWI. The EWI is an electronic wind instrument. It has sensors for air pressure, which amounts to volume control, and also for lip pressure, which amounts to vibrato. EWI keys are not mechanical. Instead, they work through conductivity, and they sense the positioning of the fingers by electrical current. That means that you can play very, very fast on this instrument. Listen to Sospone and then some other of the EWI clips on your YouTube playlist. To conclude the video, on the screen you see sorts of questions that you might expect to find on the jazz exam. After a brief pause, I'll reveal the answers, and once you've reviewed them, go ahead and proceed to the final video about jazz around the world. So here's your pause. And the answers to the questions are as follows. The new style of the 60s includes cool music, really late 50s and early 60s. Next question, which is not a jazz fusion album? That would be Kind of Blue, which is a great example of modal jazz. Which of the following is not a contemporary jazz musician from the second half of the 20th century? That would be Mary Lou Williams, at least still living today. Mary Lou Williams died several years ago, but she was really important in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then finally, there's a question about the most important and first jazz rock fusion player, and of course that is Miles Davis Jr. This concludes the video.